Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name's Rachel and this is Stitched Up. So welcome back to Top Tip Tuesdays. This is the second episode and I firstly just want to say thank you so much to everybody for all your love on last week's episode. I was absolutely blown away. You all seemed to love it. You were happy with my teaching style, etc. So yeah, I was over the moon that it was so well received. I'd asked you last week to give me lots of ideas about the types of tips and tutorials that you want to see from me, and overwhelmingly lots of you mentioned invisible zips. So that's what I'm tackling today. Now, as always, I am not a professional teacher. I do have an adult teaching qualification. However, I'm not approaching this from the stance of me trying to show you the best methods for tackling all these tips and techniques to help you with your sewing. The whole purpose of this series is to show you how I do things. I know lots of you that have followed me for a while will say things like, you don't know how I managed to get through things so fast and make them look as lovely as they do most of the time. And yeah, I thought it would just be a really good opportunity to show you how I do things. I'm not saying this is the right way or the wrong way, it's just what works for me. So this week we are tackling invisible zips, and I know that there are lots of ways to create a really good finish with an invisible zip, but this is the method that I use, and I'm sure some of you will say, oh, there's better ways, or there's this way, that way, etc., and that's absolutely fine. But as I say, this is about what I do and what works for me. So I am going to show you my technique for doing invisible zips. This is the method that I followed right back when I first started sewing, and I researched it and followed the by hand London method. So I'm going to insert the footage now. What I will say is that I am working on calico, and the reason I'm working on calico is because it's a plain fabric. I'm using a different coloured thread and a different coloured zip just so that you can see the details clearly, and you really appreciated that last week, so I'm going to continue in that vein. Obviously the calico that I've got is quite a good weight, which means that, you know, in that kind of fabric it's fairly easy to get a good finish, and I totally appreciate that in more tricky fabrics and lighter weight drapey fabrics like your viscoses and silks, etc., you are going to have to really hone your technique to get the same kind of finish. I'm not showing you on viscose today because I don't have any plain viscose, not in a light colourway, which would make it easy for you to see the details. So I am showing you this technique on calico. But what I will say is, if you are using viscose, or, you know, this technique is directly transferable to viscose fabrics. I sew with viscose fabrics all the time. Then all you need to do, if it's really not behaving, is either run a strip of interfacing along your zip line, along the raw edge of the seam that you are going to be inserting the zip in to stabilize it, or you can use spray starch as well, which will stabilize your fabric. I sometimes do that with really drapey fabrics that just aren't behaving for me. I will spray with spray starch and it just stiffens them up temporarily, which makes it a lot easier. So without further ado, grab yourself a cuppa and sit back and watch my invisible zip technique. If you have any questions, as always, I'd be delighted to hear from you in the comments section down below, and I hope you enjoy, and I'll see you again next week. Bye. To imagine that this is a dress. You've got your bodice and your skirt sewn together at the waistline seam. Your seams need to be finished. That includes your side seam and your waistline seams, because we want all these edges finished before we insert our invisible zip. So we've got both pieces here, and what we're going to be doing is we are going to be working on one side at a time. So I've got my invisible zip here. I've got a bright red one so it shows up for you. You want a zip ideally longer than what your finished zip is going to be, so that it just makes it easier to insert and adjust once your garment is constructed. What we need to do first is we need to just open these coils up by pressing with an iron, and the reason we do this is so that when we are sewing the zip to the garment we can really get into the groove before the coils. You need to be doing this with an iron that's not too hot, so have it on a medium heat, and we're not ironing over the coils, we're just ironing over the zipper tape and pressing those coils out. If your iron is too hot, you'll melt the coils, which we don't want to do that. So I'm just giving it a press here just to show you how that looks. And then we take the zip and we unzip it. Now, just above the stopper at the top, this depth here is about 5/8 of an inch. So you need to make sure that you are working with the seam allowance that your pattern is telling you to work with. So assuming that the seam allowance for this pattern is 5/8 of an inch, I'm going to align the top of the zipper tape directly with the raw edge of the top of this bodice seam. And then all along the edge, right sides together, with the edge of the zipper tape alongside the edge of the seam, and the zipper teeth want to be facing inwards towards the garment, and these are right sides together. So we're pinning this in place now, and generally with zips I will pin and tack first, but I always baste on my sewing machine. I've tried to take shortcuts and directly sew straight from pinning, but trust me, it doesn't work. So we're going to take this to the sewing machine and we're going to baste it. So I'm using a normal zipper foot. I do have an invisible zipper foot, but lots of people don't, and to be honest, you don't need one. You can do this with a normal zipper foot. What I'm doing first is I am just going to baste this zip to this side seam. So you don't need to be moving your needle or anything at this point, because we don't have to get right towards those coils. We just need to be basting this in. So I use a longer stitch length at this point because we might need to adjust the zip if we don't get it in exactly the right place. Use a long basting stitch, or you can hand tack if you prefer, but we are just basting one side of the zipper tape, right sides together with the coils facing towards the garment and the zipper tape to the raw edge of the seam, which could either be a centre back or a side seam, and it should look something like this. So I've just done this in white thread so that you can see. And then moving back to the garment, we're now going to just zip up the zip just to make sure we've not caught it at all, and then we need to make sure that it's placed exactly along that waist seam when we stitch the other side. So what we're going to do is we're just going to mark with a pen. You can use a friction pen or some tailor's chalk. We're just going to mark on the other side of the zipper tape where it lines up with that waistband seam there. So remember, this zip isn't stitched on that side yet. And then what we do is we unzip it, and then we're going to turn that tape over and then over again on the other side seam of your other piece, and we're going to just line up that mark that we've just made with the waistband seam on the other side. So we need to get this really accurate so that when this side is stitched in place, they line up. So remember, the coils need to be facing inwards towards your garment with the zipper tape, edge of the zipper tape along the edge of your garment. And we're just going to then continue pinning the rest of the zip. The first bit that you really need to make sure is accurate is where that waistband seam is. Obviously, if you're doing a full pattern piece with no waistband seam, you don't need to worry about that. You can just line it up with the top. But if you've got a waistband seam or any kind of seam in where your zip is going to be, then you need to line that seam up first to make sure that it looks right when it's stitched in place. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take this back to the sewing machine and we're going to baste the other side in place. When you're working with an invisible zip, you need to make sure that you don't stitch the seam where you're putting the invisible zip together at all. You want to work on two completely flat pieces that haven't been stitched together. And the reason for that will become clear shortly. So you can see there, hopefully now, when I zip up this zip, it should be in alignment and that waistband seam is almost bang on. I'm pretty impressed with that actually. So what we need to do now is, I'm happy with that. If you're not happy, then you just need to obviously undo your basting and reposition it and then rebaste it. But I'm happy with that. So what we're going to do now is we need to actually make this zip invisible. And we're going to take this over to the sewing machine, and we need to move the position of the needle over to more or less the edge of our zipper foot. So you can see that I've done that there. And then what we need to do now is we position the edge of the zipper foot right next to those coils and then drop your needle. And then using your fingers, you can just open those coils a little bit further to find the groove and stitch directly in that groove. If you do this really slowly and pull out the coils as I'm showing you here, you can get right into that groove and make sure that you're not stitching over the coils. Do it really, really slowly. There's no rush with this. And you should find that you get right into those coils. I have sped this up, by the way. I'm not normally sewing at this speed. Okay, so what you can see now is you can see my basting threads, and then you can see my stitching threads that have gone right into that groove in between the coils. So what I do next is I just try the zip again before we sew the remaining side of the zipper tape, and we just want to do this just to make sure that we haven't caught any coils in our stitching. I'm quite happy with that, so I'm going to now unzip it, take it back to the sewing machine, and we're going to stitch the other side of the zipper tape in place in exactly the same way as we've just done. So here we are back at the sewing machine, and we're working on the other side, and we're just going to do exactly the same thing. We are positioning the edge of the zipper foot right against those coils, dropping the needle in place, and then using your finger of your left hand to just pull out those zipper coils as much as you can. And because this is basted, it's not going to move around, it's really stable. And then we're just going to sew all the way along. You've got to be careful that you do keep your fingers out of the way here, because it's easy to have a finger in the way of the needle and have a bit of a nasty accident. We don't want any of that. So here we are again, just showing you where that stitching is. I don't take out my basting threads because I think it gives you an extra bit of strength. I'm just snipping off those loose threads here so they don't get caught in my zip when I zip it up, and then we'll see how we go. So sometimes you can just catch your fabric a little bit, but that's okay, just wiggle your zip about. And then we just need to go give this a press now. But I'm really happy with how that zip is centered along that waistband seam there. It's nice and neat and pretty accurate. So yeah, we just need to give this a press, and once we've pressed it, you then need to finish off the bottom of your zip and the remaining seam, because the rest of the seam of your garment where the zipper tape is inserted should still be completely open. So folding your garment in half, right sides together, you need to pull the remaining portion of your zip out of the way, and then we're going to stitch the rest of that seam down. So pull the zip out of the way, put a pin in place, and because you've pressed it, you should have a little groove, sort of press area where you've pressed it, which is really handy to show you where to actually sew. So you still need your zipper foot to do this little bit here, but I just move the zipper foot over to the other side for this one. And then what we are going to do is we're going to move the needle back over almost to the outer edge of the zipper foot on the other side. We are going to butt the outer edge of the zipper foot right up to where the zip is, and then yeah, move that needle across to the outer edge of it, and then just use your turn wheel on your sewing machine just to check that you're happy with the placement of where the needle is going to hit through, and then you can just continue sewing down the rest of that seam to close your seam off, which is just a little bit here for demonstration purposes. And then when this is done, you should have something like this. So your zip is inserted, the remainder of your seam where your zip is inserted is now fully stitched like that. and give it all a good press, and it should look something like that. So if you've used a longer zip as I have, you will need to shorten your zip at this point. So all I'm going to do is I'm just checking first that the zip is okay, that it zips up okay. Yeah, we've got no puckers there or little bumps or anything. I'm really happy with that. I'm just going to cut off the bottom of this zip at this point here, but you just need it an inch or two below the zip insertion where it's fully stitched in. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to run a zigzag stitch across the bottom of that there, just so that it doesn't come undone. I'm just using my normal clear view foot that I use for most of my stitching to do this, and then I'm just using a narrow zigzag stitch, or you can use a bar tack stitch, whatever kind you want really, just to stitch over those coils on the little bit of your zipper tape at the bottom, just to create a new zip stop really, so that it doesn't actually come undone. It just gives you an extra bit of security like that. And then there we have it. We've now got a fully inserted invisible zip with a waistband seam that is absolutely perfectly aligned, and the zip looks invisible. All your edges are nicely finished on the inside, and yeah, it's as simple as that.